Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is very, very late into the night, and I'm recording my patch note rundown because when I tried to do it on stream in the middle of the day, I was having internet issues, so it just didn't work out. So I'm gonna give you guys a really quick and dirty patch note rundown. Today we're gonna be talking about patch 8.19. This is the second round. The focus has changed on the World Championships. This is what the World Championship is gonna be played on. So generally speaking, I kind of like what the patch is going to be played on, and I think prior to this patch, me actually physically reading the patch notes, it's the first time I ever knew a lot of the champions are going to be changed. And part of that is because for the first time ever, or in a long time, Ryder ended up tweeting about the champions that they were going to change in the patch coming up. And so I never really expected this. Let me pull up the kind of tweet right now so you can know what to expect before we kind of scroll down. So here is Richard Henkel. He is someone who works at Riot, not sure his official title. And he gave a list of 11 champions, or 10 champions and one item they were looking to buff. Elise, Darius, Fiora, Calyx, Jarvan, Kogmaw, Thresh, Pike, Janna, Nunu, Leandries. So these are all the things I expect to see in the current patch. I don't know if there's more or any less. I kind of have already done this before, so I know there isn't really that much more, but that's quite decent for what I would say a patch right before the end of the season. And you're not looking for many big changes on this patch. This is the patch that you want to keep relatively stable so the pros don't need to relearn new stuff, and so that people can generally flesh out metas on this patch. So without further ado, let's get into it. So first champion that got buff is Darius. The W base damage increased, E armor pen increased. He as a valuable counter to pick the top laners. We're looking to help Darius cleave through some of the armor to encourage teams to think strategically when drafting top lane champions. All right, look, here's the real deal. So top lane tanks are too good right now. Stuff like Sion, stuff like Cho'Gath are doing too much for their team. And even you can't really counterpick them because if you fall behind in stuff like Darius or stuff like Fiora, it's just not as easy to play games with either of these two champions as it is to play with a tank. And so I think it's a pretty big liability to play, or big risk. And what they're doing is they're trying to minimize the risk a little bit so that you can have more possible picks in the top lane. So they buffed his crippling strike by 0.1 AD ratio and his apprehend by 5%. Pretty good buffs, honestly. Definitely will help him out quite a bit. And I think that, you know what? It's fine. I want there to be a little bit more diversity top lane. I don't want to see Sion, Cho'Gath, Urgot, Aatrox every game. I think it'd be nice to be able to see a little bit more. And I think that Darius should be a tank killer. That's kind of what he's made. Stuff like Darius, stuff like Fiora, stuff like Alawi are pretty much built to crush tanks. And I want them to exist in that facet. So what did Fiora get? She got a little bit more healing early game, plus 10 on vital healing. At the early passive procs, I think this will help quite a bit in her early laning phase, and I think that'll help her scale throughout the lane. So it's nice, and like I said before, I think this is one of Riot's pushes to be like, hey, let's have more options against tanks. And I think generally the idea is correct. I don't want tanks to be the only thing that gets played top lane. It's like a running joke that every time around playoffs, you're gonna be in a situation where tanks get more and more strong, so that impact pops off more. And so while this might be really good or might not be very good for TL, ideally I want to have as much variety as possible in the top lane meta for Worlds. Now this is a buff I don't necessarily know if I agree with. Calyx got buffed because he's been struggling to start changes to evolved R in 8-11. But every time I see this champion solo queue, I don't agree with that. I think Calyx is fairly good, and he snowballs really, really hard. And so I think he got considerable buffs. 0.2 damage buff onto his AD ratio for his passive, as well as Void Spike buff. That's 20% non-isolated and 90% isolated. That's insane. This might actually make Void Spike valuable enough to level or evolve first, alongside the Q evolve. I think that's what people are doing right now. I actually think this is nuts, and especially around levels like usually. You might take wings at level 11 to the second evolve, but now I think taking anything but W might be a griefing pretty much. I think that the amount of slow you can get with W right now is just unbelievable, and that can allow you to control skirmishes and team fights a lot. So Calyx got quite a big buff. I don't necessarily know if he needed this buff. I think competitive play, yes, Calyx was relatively weak, but from a solo queue perspective, I think Calyx is always a champion that's very, very scary to buff. and I am not going to enjoy playing against this guy in solo queue with these level of buffs. Let's keep going. Elise. So let's talk AP junglers. AP assassin junglers don't really exist in the game outside of Evelynn. I think that Elise has always been kind of a core solo queue heavy ganker. You rush Moby Boots, run around and kill everyone. And because of that, and because of her effectiveness in solo queue or in competitive play, she got nerfed left and right, right? But right now you're not really seeing much AP damage from the jungle. You're seeing maybe Gragas with one AP item or kind of tanks like that. And then there's Eve. I think that having the option to have different types of damage sources in the jungle is really valuable. So you're able to kind of mix and match different types of damage throughout your team comp. Like I like playing a lot of 80s mid. If I play with an Elise or play with Evelynn or play with a Talia, you're able to do that. And so Talia and Eve or Evelynn are like kind of the two top tier APs. And with maybe Nidalee being in there, I wouldn't mind seeing an Elise. I don't, especially because if you look at what they did, they ended up lowering her repel cooldown, which helps her mobility and defensively, and they lowered her W cooldown, which helps her clear better. They at no point lowered her or increased her burst. I think it's a good way to tackle Elise. So good buffs. Jarvan, passive cooldown decreased. I like it. You know, I like that. I think that Jarvan is best champion best suited to combo with other champions. So when you think of Jarvan, you think of great comps like Jarvan Rumble, comp that C9 used to run years ago. You think of comps like Jarvan Galio, Jarvan Xerath, Jarvan Ziggs, Jarvan maybe Singe W. You know, you're able to use Jarvan ulti in combination with other facets of your team to be able to create like a great play. And I think I miss that. Like I like being able to see that. I think it's really cool in competitive play to see that. I think what they did was they just buffed the passive by 4 seconds early and 2 seconds in the mid game. And I think this is great. Super good. I think that this lets him clear a lot faster. Doesn't increase his burst on skirmishes or on ganks, but it just makes him jungle a little bit better. And I think that's what he struggles with a lot right now. I like this a lot. Nunu Willop. I think Nunu's kind of changed a lot. He shifted a lot from his original kind of play. Nunu used to originally be a champion that you would take with a hyper carry AD or Azir and crush counter jungle extensively early game and then look to use the hyper carry and frontline for them late game. Nowadays, Nunu is kind of traded off a lot of that scaling potential and consistency with the ability to gank. So he's a better ganker and a slightly better skirmisher. And I think that right now he's terrible at going full AP. So what did they end up doing? So I love the AP build. I think it's super fun. I think Nunu in general is more fun to play than before, but he's pretty painful to play if you go AP. I really like the fact that they buffed 2.2 ratio here. They buff the ratio by like 0.3 here if you get them with the root. I think that you want to be buffing Nunu's most enjoyable way to play, which is the AP. I don't necessarily think it's super OP either, and I think that ideally Nunu builds a combination of AP and tank. That's usually what I've seen so far. And I wouldn't mind seeing more buffs like this, like they put in. So I like this a lot. Janna, this is kind of weird. I think Janna is typically used a lot to counterpick champions like Alistar. Like she's a scaling pick that works well with hyper scaling ADs or just ADs in general, and she's a great disengaged champion. But right now she's not seeing play even when Alistar's super meta. I think that she's too difficult to play, and even though let's say she's got one of the lowest skill floors of any champ in the game. Like if you're gonna get carried, you're gonna be playing Janna, right? I think that buffing her a little bit, not a bad idea. So they gave her a little bit more bonus move C conversion to W, helps her early poke. You know what? I'm okay. I think that's pretty reasonable. Now, this is a buff I love. The Thresh Q mana costing cooldown decreased. Great buff. I love this because I think that ever since Pike was introduced, this madman down here, Thresh has kind of lost a little bit of his identity because I think Pike does a lot of what Thresh does more consistently or better. And other supports do more consistent stuff than Thresh. Like Thresh is definitely a risky pick, but he's not getting much payoff for that level of risk. So now I think being able to throw more death sentences, especially early game, 4 seconds off level 1 and 20 mana cost is great. I think that if Thresh doesn't snowball early game, he's kind of not that useful, and I really want him to have that level of identity. I don't mind that in the game, and I think that like he is not being seen. He's not seen enough play because he's not consistent enough, and this will help him out a lot. Pike, of all the things to buff, everything in the game about Pike, increasing his ability cooldown for Q, increasing his damage for Q, increasing E. This, aside from buffing the E stun duration, is probably the strangest thing for me to see. So they buffed his ulti damage early, not just by a little bit, by a lot. 50 more damage at level 1 is 25% damage increase for his ulti, which is insane. And Pike is a scaling champion, and the reason why he scales is because whenever he ulti kills someone, he doubles the gold you gain pretty much for the kill. So I don't think Pike is weak. I think Pike is really strong, and the only reason you're not seeing him at Worlds is because he's more risky to play. But I would still think even without this buff, you would see a little bit of him at Worlds. And definitely with this buff, I know they want to see him at Worlds, but Pike is like such a dominant solo queue champion right now that it's so scary to see buffs like this, because I'm just like, well, I guess I'm going to have to see Pike every single game I play. And I think that, like I said before, a lot of Pike's strengths kind of negate Thresh, and the same champions that are good against Pike, Morgana, for instance, or Kench, are also good against Pike as well. And so, but probably even better against Thresh. And so I think that, not a champion I wanted to see a buff on, to be honest. I thought it was perfectly acceptable. Kench. Kench is with a couple of other champions, a champion I would say that just completely destroys certain champions. He is a aggressive kind of stop block. Just when you try to make a play, he just throws up the sign and says no. That's how I see it. So against Rengars or against Morgana or against Lissandra, Tahm Kench is your man, or your Kench, to be able to save you from those types of team comps, especially if you're a squishy AD or a squishy mid laner. So I think he's too strong for what he brings, and generally by too strong I mean he's too tanky. So I really like the fact that they nerfed the base stats here. They nerfed the base health grip. I like that. I think that's really reasonable for what he does. His value to bring in the game. I don't also think he should have such high defensive utility as well. Kogmaw is, I guess, really strange as a champion buff. I think that increasing the move speed by 5 is barely, it's okay. And increasing the range on his artillery it's only effectiveness. It only affected level 6, right? The 1300. It's okay. I think this champion is a champion that will see more play depending on what ADs are meta. So I remember Kogmaw is primarily something like a Vayne counter pick, or a counter pick against specific champions, or if on-hit items are super overtuned. I think that if we see stuff like Vayne, or if we see stuff like, I don't know, Callista, I think is what Cog used to beat as well, Cog will come back in full force. But unless those champions become meta, these buffs aren't going to make him good. I don't mind these buffs though, because generally I think Kogmaw's pretty weak, so sure, give him whatever you got. Now Liandry's, this is a really interesting item. I actually think Liandry's is really slept on. The problem with Liandry's is it shares the same item slot as Morels. So generally speaking, the extra magic penetration and the healing reduction gives you more utility and more damage than what this brings. But I don't necessarily know if that's true, actually. I think that's what people think. The biggest thing about Liandry's is it gives you a passive 10% damage increase. It's just that the value of penetration, the first pen item, the whatchamacallit, Oblivion Orb, is so high that sometimes you buy the item and then just complete the rest of your build, because you don't need Morels unless you need the utility. I think that's always been wrong. I think that's been wrong for multiple seasons now. Even last season, Double Pen was a disgustingly broken stat. And this season, nothing changed. It's still a broken stat. In fact, you still end up getting usually mana item Morellos, or Morels is a lot of people, or mana item Oblivion Orb. And I think that's crazy that Riot's changed the AP itemization never thought that would be an issue. So my big take on this is the fact that Liandry's is one small buff away from being seen everywhere, pretty much. Because as soon as one of this item is better than the other item, this item is going to be bought on pretty much everyone. And they're trying to differentiate what this item's useful for. So they lowered the AP a little bit and made it so he's better against. It's supposed to be a tank killer. And if you notice in the patch notes, what do they end up buffing? Kogmaw kills tanks quite well. Whatchamacallit? Fiora kills tanks, Darius kills tanks. They're trying to set up a little bit more of like anti-tank killing and maybe give a little bit more identity toward Leandries. I don't think that's bad. I think that's actually correct. You need to separate Leandries away from Morels. Outside of, and Morels is like the healing debuff, but it's also the max damage item. I don't necessarily know if that should be true all the time. I'm kind of really scared about this item because this item I think is generally slept on, like I said before, and does more than you'd expect. This is already an item you want to buy on brand and an item you want to buy on champions like Swain most of the times. And I think that this item is just a 5 pen it's a small 5 pen nerf on Oblivion Orb away from becoming meta. It might actually be meta with this. I think maybe 0.5% max health is a lot of damage. If you've ever played a Mumu, you know how much like percentage max health burn actually does. So this is a very interesting change. I will be keeping my eyes on this. I like their idea of what they want to do with it, but I think that you just gotta be a little bit careful with this item for sure. What else is there? Baron Nashor, normal draft matchmaking. I don't play normal draft. Announcer steal announcements, objective steal announcements. I think that's pretty cool. That's pretty much it. Pretty straightforward patch. I like a lot of it. I'm a little bit worried about Pike and Calyx, and I like pretty much everything else. I think this is a good patch for Worlds. They didn't change very too much, and I think the patch right now is pretty pretty good for a viewing experience. So pretty excited for Worlds. I like what they did a lot. I am most excited for preseason now. So please, Riot Games, give me something to be excited about next patch. Okay. Love you guys. I'll see you guys later.